They told my family I was dead. I sat in a field in the Ardennes and listened to that rumor like it was a stranger's voice, watching it name a life that still breathed. I'm 89 now, and I say this at the start because truth and memory do strange things when you carry them for decades. Sometimes you are listed on a paper as finished, and sometimes the self you thought you were dies in a single winter morning. Waking up, in the literal sense, stepping back from whatever death had claimed me, changed everything. Waking up in the moral sense, the awakening that came in a smell of gasoline and the sight of what men will burn to deny an enemy, changed the man I would become. I should say plainly, I speak as one of many who were there. I am a composite voice for those who rode in armored vehicles down those narrow Ardennes roads, for the drivers redirected and the quartermasters who opened boxes in the snow. I do not claim to be a famous commander whose name sits in some book. I was a lieutenant, then a captain by necessity, a man meant to kill machines and keep ours running. What I tell you is stitched from memory and from the records I later read, from maps I held and from the faces of comrades who never came home. When I say I mean the thousands of hands that pushed jerry cans, the men who listened to orders under rain and shell fire, the ones who learned the hard truth. A war is a plumbing problem as much as it is a fight. If this story matters to you, if you like deep dives into how the largest machines of war came to pass, stay with me and subscribe. There are more of these moments to uncover. December 1944 was not supposed to be a lesson in supply chains. For us, it was a gamble. We crawled through cold country lanes that had been narrow before the war and were choked with mud, wreckage, and the corpses of vehicles that had tried to outrun weather and artillery. The Ardennes in mid-December looked like a place the world had forgotten. Black trees, white patches of snow, and a sky that seemed to press down on your shoulders. Everyone knew how thin our fuel supplies had become. Orders were clipped. Conserve. Siphon only what you must. Move in tight columns to hide our movement. Take what the land gives and leave the rest. There was a fatalist humor to it, the kind that keeps your hand steady, but under it lived real fear. No fuel meant no tanks. No tanks meant no spearhead. No spearhead meant the plan folded like a map left in the rain. Our intelligence had been full of hopeless words. We had heard rumors, whispered in the dark, about massive Allied depots, pipelines, convoys that seemed to flow with petroleum like a river. But rumors are a poor substitute for a barrel at your feet when you watch your driver push with the rest of you to get an engine started. We had been trained that audacity could break a line, that surprise could take a bridge. We had not been trained for the arithmetic that underwrote modern war. How many refineries, how many barrels, how many ships and trucks and pipelines it takes to keep armies moving. That arithmetic, I would learn, is what makes or breaks a campaign. We found Hansfeld in the second week of the Ardennes push. The village lay tucked into a hollow that showed no sign of the spectacle to come. We rounded a bend, and there it was. Rows of jerry cans and drums stacked like a makeshift harbor. The smell of gasoline so strong it made the back of my throat ache. Men who had been walking on nerves and rationed hope suddenly laughed. They held up empty tins and sang like children finding treasure. For a moment, the whole miserable world had been turned into a marketplace. I remember the manifests because I was not a man who could see worth in joy without curiosity. In those first hours, someone found paperwork in a crate box that had been left with the drums. Greasy, smudged manifests that smelled faintly of oil and cigarette ash. They were in English, papers stamped with ports and dates, and a name, Texas. Homemade handwriting marked quantities. A number kept sticking in my head that later, in after-war readings, I would find echoed in Allied supply records. Tens of thousands of gallons. According to Allied logistics reports, the capture at Hansfeld accounted for roughly 50,000 gallons of gasoline, enough to feed a substantial portion of a small armored formation for days. I could not reconcile what I saw with what the German command had told us each morning. Restriction, economy, strangulation at the pumps. You can imagine what men do with gasoline in their hands.
They pour it into cans and siphon it into tanks. They smear it over gloves and clothes in small private attempts to warm fingers. You can imagine what a commander does with a manifest. He reads the routes, the source, the movement. Shipments listed a path from refineries and ports in the West, through supply nodes and railheads that only in the past months had been reclaimed and organized. There were names on those pages that have a bland dignity: ports, depots, convoys. Behind those names was a system of moving wealth the size of a nation, and for the first time it struck me that our entire enterprise was a brittle thread compared to that rope. Archival records later framed what we had stumbled into. The Allies, by the winter of 1944, had made fuel a weapon of its own. Pipelines under the sea and across liberated France fed forward to points just behind the front. The British had experimented with an undersea pipeline project, and American logistics organized truck convoys that would become legendary for their persistence, the so-called Red Ball Express. Those systems did not just move gasoline, they moved the confidence of entire armies. When you can melt a steel bridge and still feel you have enough fuel, you move differently.
When you must guard every drop and watch your tanks die with empty bellies, you fight differently. That morning at Hansfeld, our boys were not thinking of strategy, they were thinking of warmth and motion. We siphoned what we could. Men who had scarcely slept tore at seals and filters, cursing in a dozen dialects. We put a temporary tag on some drums, and I remember the absurdity of watching a corporal argue the merit of a single drum like a banker arguing a bond. Every drum became a promise. We did not have the leisure to celebrate. Orders came down in the thin, bureaucratic language the war had taught us. The reconnaissance boys had found maps, and those maps had dots and arrows and words that stopped any easy optimism. There were points marked with codes, depots several kilometers apart, each a reservoir on a scale we had not expected. More troubling were the reports of demolition teams. The Allied engineers we had once thought would be meticulous salvagers were doing something else. They were destroying what they could not secure. People who have not watched engineers set fire to millions might not grasp the horror of a deliberate inferno. At Stavelot, a name that would stick in our teeth later, the Americans, by careful planning or by an instinct born of supply, had burned a captured depot. The flames rose like a wall. Smoke turned the sky to a bruise. Men shouted, but no one could stop it. They waited until our scouts had come in and then pushed a match to what we would have died for. To watch a storehouse of fuel turn to light and ash is to see both your hunger and your opponent's power in a single image. I have spoken with historians about Stavelot in the years since. They point out what we could not see from our frozen boots. Burning that volume of fuel was a decision with strategic and psychological force. It denied us resources we had lived inside of for weeks and broadcast a message in smoke and flame we could afford to destroy because more would always come. Allied logistic cables, recorded later in operations reports, showed convoys and pipeline rates that made destruction affordable as denial. For the men on the ground, the act felt like insult as much as tactic. We were not above reacting with the petty violence of scavengers. Men tried to pull nails from wreckage, to take lantern glass and straps as trophies. There was also sudden, quiet despair. I watched a driver sit by a disabled Panther, hands in his face, while a sergeant told him to leave it. Engines stood with hoods open like surgical patients abandoned on the operating table. The landscape filled with the silhouettes of heavy machines parked and empty, their pictures later used as proof that the assault was stalling. Even then, there were things happening that we only later understood as stages in a much larger machine. Convoys behind the front, which we had once seen as mere lines of trucks, were hydraulic in their effect. They regulated hunger and fed effort.
Allied production figures, printed in post-war studies, put into numbers what we felt as sensation. Far more refineries, more tankers, more trucks rolling in numbers we could not match. It was not only a question of bravery or tactics. Factories in faraway places made decisions the battlefield could not overrule. I remember a moment there that felt like the hinge of a door. We had a small parley with a British prisoner, a man who had once been a mechanic by his talk, and he spoke of the Red Ball convoys as if they were an army unto themselves. They keep feeding themselves, he said through a translator. They take nothing for granted. If one truck is lost, 10 more are ready. His eyes were weary, but not fearful. There was a kind of contempt behind that observation. Contempt not for us, but for the idea that any front could be kept alive by heroics alone. It burned into me that we did not have the luxury to move as they did. We had to be sparing, cunning, and cruelly practical about what we used. And yet, hope is a stubborn thing. When we first reached Hansfeld, the mood turned reckless for a few hours. Men who had been told to weigh every kilometer took off in roars, tanks starting like songs. We drove with a boldness born of sudden fuel. For a time, it felt like the old confidence might be restored, the kind you have when a plan is more than a piece of paper and becomes a muscle again. We were not thinking of pipelines and refineries, or of the people back home who built the trucks and the fuel that kept them running. We were thinking only of the present, of engines knowing the taste of oil again. There was a darker side to that jubilation. Along with our triumph came voices telling us the cost of fighting had a moral rotation we could not ignore. We had heard, in hushed packets passed from group to group, about a massacre at Malmedy, prisoners of war shot in cold blood. Rumors are the raw material of fear, and that one was too intact to dismiss. It was later confirmed in courts and records. A group of American prisoners had been executed. I will not turn away or soften that fact. It was a crime, and I condemned it then as I do now. Killing prisoners without trial or mercy stripped the war of any pretense of honorable combat. When such things happen, the men who commit them do not exist in a moral vacuum. They are part of an apparatus that dehumanizes and destroys, and to be swept into the same current by duty is no defense. We had men among us who were capable of the worst orders. I refuse to gloss that with arguments of obedience. The atrocity at Malmedy left a stain on both memories and the argument that warfare is merely a clash of tactics. It reminded us, in dreadful detail, that human beings can choose cruelty when given the fog of orders and the anonymity of uniforms. We had to reckon with that while we still had the breath to do so. Back at Hansfeld, while some of us siphoned and others argued, my job was to look forward.
I walked through the stacks of drums and found the oddities: shipping stamps from British ports, chalk marks indicating rail numbers. A careful eye could read the story of a supply line: refinery to tanker, tanker to port, port to ship, ship to beachhead, beachhead to rail, rail to truck, truck to depot. It was a long chain, and each link glinted with the fact that the Allies had rebuilt theirs faster than we could break ours. The manifest we found traced a neat arc: production in the American South, transatlantic movement to British ports, a forward pipeline into France. It was not a miracle. It was the operation of industry wired into warfare. We tried to take advantage of it. Our orders shifted: seize depots, cut pipelines, capture convoys. For every small success we had, there were losses. A column stalled for hours by blown bridges, a radio that failed at the worst moment, a driver who misread a sign in the snow and drove into a field that was a mine. The narrow lanes of the Ardennes were only fit for the smallest of ambitions. The Allies, in contrast, had rebuilt a logistical net off the French coast that let them spool supplies forward once they had the beaches and the rails. On the fourth day after Hansfeld, we reported to a crossroads where the map showed a concentration of depots. The cold pressed in my ears. Wind had stripped the trees of leaves, and the ground squeaked under our boots. Men moved like animals used to the dark. We found another supply point. This one was larger, and it had been prepared to be defended. Guards lay scattered, blood drying in thin black circles on white snow. That sight jolted something in me. Not the horror of death alone, but the arithmetic of it. How many men had to live, die, and keep pace for this flow to continue? How many hands at home had to work months ahead to pour fuel into drums that would become a furnace in front of us? Then the signal came through: demolition orders. Someone in the rear had decided that if they could not hold a supply, they should make sure the enemy could not have it either. I do not know the command structure that made that cold decision. Maybe it was a local engineer, maybe higher. What I know is the effect. We watched the tanks of a captured depot burn as if the sky itself had been torn open. The flames were impossible and luminous. They threw orange light across men's faces like a torch set to a history. The sound was not only crackle, it was a constant, hungry roar. I remember thinking, with a clarity I could not later explain, that the enemy burning what we would have given our lives for was not merely a tactical move.
It was a message we could not swallow. They had the luxury of denial. They could set fire to their own resources and still expect the next convoys to arrive. They could destroy to create a strategic impossibility for us while replenishing their own needs elsewhere.
We who had measured life in drops were asked to surrender to that kind of waste as if it were some new currency. It was in those flames at Stavolo that my former self, the one who thought winning was a matter of courage and navigation alone, died. I do not mean that I stopped feeling or that I surrendered my will. I mean that a certain naive map of the world burned up with that depot. Where once I had placed all meaning on tactics and valor, a colder calculus stepped in. Production, pipelines, statistics. I remember the dizzying clarity, like the flash before an explosion. Numbers replaced heroics in my mind. It was not that bullets mattered less. It was that armies are fed by numbers, and numbers can outweigh courage. That realization did not comfort me. It frightened me. To wake up and see the true scales of warfare is to become small. It is to realize that your bravery can be overwhelmed by a factory's output or a pipeline's capacity. It is to understand that the fate of men on the ground can be preordained by decisions made in a boardroom, a shipyard, or a repair depot thousands of miles away. For a while after Stavolo, I walked like a man who had learned a new language and could not find anyone who spoke it. We tried to adapt. Our orders shifted again. Preserve, take what you can, deny where possible. We abandoned tanks that would not start, and we left behind armored hulks that later would be photographed as the trophies of a stalled offensive. Men who had spent their youth learning to fix engines found themselves throwing away their work. There was a bitter arithmetic to abandonment. One more tank could mean another man saved, but you could not liquidate all of your force into a single salvage, so we made choices that felt like failure. As we moved on from Stavolo, the world narrowed. The front lines crawled back and forth like a fevered pulse. The cold cut deeper, lips split. We began to see the toll in small human items, letters never sent, photographs buried in breeches, buttons clinging to empty sleeves. I remember a boy, no older than 19, who clutched a postcard of a girl with a train of flowers painted on the corner. He kept it folded inside his helmet like a relic. When our column ran out of fuel and we had to leave the tank behind, he stood and watched it go, and then let out a kind of sound you only hear sometimes in great exhaustion. A low, animal thing that is part grief and part release. And then came the long miles on foot. In the days after that infernal fire, orders came to withdraw and regroup. Men who had once sat inside armored cars took to walking and hitchhiking and trying to move with what little they could salvage. We had to cross lines with hands that had once commanded turrets, and we had to listen to the clatter of Allied logistics as if it were thunder moving around us. When you walk in the wake of supply, you hear the sound of the world turning, and it is not a comforting sound. It was around then that the first rumors began to reach us, not of heroic charges, but of reality, that we had been out-resourced in a way that made tactical brilliance meaningless. That revelation moved through the ranks like a cold wind. Men began to understand that courage could not refill a tank. They began to bury a kind of pride. I bury it in my chest even now. The stubbornness that once kept me pressing forward became overnight an acknowledgement of limits. That is where I stop for now, not at the end of a campaign, but at an awakening. I stood among burning drums and empty tanks and felt my old certainties disintegrate in the heat. The paper that once could list me among the dead had no purchase on this new knowledge. I woke up to the arithmetic of war, and waking changed the way I judged everything that came after. We left the flames behind, but the heat did not stop clinging to my skin. It followed us like a smell you can't wash out, a memory that keeps the body tensing as if the next explosion is just around a bend. We moved in ragged detachments after Stavolo, slipping between trees and across frozen fields. The machines we had loved and cursed left as hulks in the mud. It felt like a retreat and a funeral at once.
Men carried what they could on their backs and in their hands. Some carried only shame. A few days after the burning, we were cut off. The roads we had known were now braided with Allied movement and hemmed in by ice and shell holes. Orders were fragments: fall back, regroup, attempt to feed the remaining vehicles. Radio reception was poor. Our signalsmen were working with wires and overloaded batteries. At dawn one morning, a column of our lorries that was supposed to be a lifeline simply did not arrive. A rumor moved faster than any messenger. The flank had been turned. We tried to move as if calculation could be made into courage. It could not. I was separated from most of my company during a night march. A hedge that was supposed to mark a safe lane turned out to be a minefield, or a patrol confused for hours. I cannot be sure now which. I remember the noise more than the sight. A wrong footstep, a metallic bite, an explosion that put a ringing in my head and sent me past the point of knowing where I was. There is a thin place in memory where pain blurs into nothing and then sharpens back up. I woke up to an English voice asking me my name. They processed us the way armies do when they have found bodies and people together. Hands searched pockets for papers, for letters, for identification tags. I had none on me. My dog tags lay under a boot that had been torn in the scuffle. For a time, I was a number. They put us with other prisoners and walked us toward what they said were collection points. The sky was a steel plate. Snow had turned to filth under the boots. When you are a prisoner for the first time, you focus on the immediate. Warmth, food, the shape of other men's faces.
I had conversations with a kid who did not know where his village was anymore. An old sergeant who could still get a laugh out of a cigarette taken from a stranger's hand. There is a strange human calm among men who have been beaten by circumstance. They do not always argue about the past, but they carry it like a coat. We were lined up, counted, and put into trucks that took us to a tented camp behind the lines. It smelled of cold wool and damp canvas, and outside, artillery thudded as if someone were trying to remind us that the war still existed for those with engines and radios. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a clerk at a distant headquarters was filling forms. In the confusion of retreat and advance, the bureaucracy of war is both absurd and fatal. Reports left and arrived, names were transcribed and mistranscribed, and in one bundle of papers that made its way through a postal delay and a fatigued desk, my name appeared in a list that read KIA. I later saw in a pile of returned items and photocopies given to me at a post-war archive a fragment of that record. It is an odd thing to see your name on a list for the dead, a thing you know in your chest is untrue because you are breathing, but which has the power to claim a life in other hands. I need to say plainly, the detail I tell here about being officially declared dead is composite, part memory, part what would have been plausible in that chaos. Records were lost, names were misread, and families did receive the wrong news in ways historians have documented. What I own to memory is the moment I learned my family had been told something I was not. The paperwork I later saw matched that pattern. Whether the exact line that marked my death was written on one day or another is less important than the reality that a human life can be folded into a ledger and that those entries change how people act toward one another. Being declared dead on paper changed the world for me and for those at home. My mother received a letter with the kind of formal language armies use, stiff lines meant to be comforting, but which carry the weight of finality. She had to begin the rituals of mourning for a son who would later return with mud in his hair and a face that did not fit the portrait she had folded around his memory. She kept a small packet of his things, and neighbors lit candles, and a hush entered rooms that had once been loud with expectation. When I finally made it back into territory where Red Cross papers could be exchanged, I learned of the wreath, the small display of a life closed in that village church. I thought then about how we catalog loss: an official notice, a folded cloth, a line in a register. Paper has an authority that flesh does not always get. Prisoner of war camps were, for many of us, a strange interlude of less violence but more contemplation. We were fed, in a manner of speaking. We received letters through neutral agencies. Sometimes news arrived about the course of the war, sometimes not. In the camp we traded skills and stories. A man who had been a barber before the war cut hair with a pocket knife. Another taught us how to stitch a boot so it might hold a few more miles. We played card games with rules that felt like old economies, small bets of bread and tobacco. In my head, the arithmetic of supply had not quit. It had taken a new form. We were now dependent on permission and rationing by those who held the food lines. I could see the same calculus, what am I owed, what will be given, played out in minuscule acts. When the war ended for us, when the front calmed and the paperwork changed from capture to repatriation, there was no triumphant parade. Men returned in pieces. Many of my comrades came back with faces I recognized, and minds I did not. Some were hollowed by what they had seen. Some had been hardened into a kind of angry practicality. When trains finally ran and I walked off a cattle wagon into the city I had left years before, I found a country that was itself rebuilding. Houses propped like hands, factories cleared and restarting, people with the look of those who had kept watch for too long. The post-war years complicate simple narratives. There was a relief at being alive, a tangible gratitude towards small things, warm bread, running water, the sound of a child's laughter. At the same time, I learned that waking up to truth is not a single event, but a series of adjustments. I had woken up, as I said, to the arithmetic of war. That knowledge lived with me in civilian life. I found work in the rail yards for a time, where the cadence of loading and unloading trains reminded me of the supply loops that had once carried gasoline from refineries to depots. I watched men weld and rivet and move crude containers that would have seemed miraculous to my wartime self. Industry, I realized, keeps nations alive not only by making steel, but by shaping choices. I married in a small ceremony that seemed to be more about survival than romance at first, and later, when the country steadied, a kinder love grew. We had children, and the ordinary business of making a life felt like a victory in its own right. But the old images returned with the seasons. Each winter I would feel the Ardennes under my skin. The smell of gasoline can send me back to Hansfeld faster than any photograph. People asked if I forgave. Forgiveness is not a simple ledger either. I could condemn actions, name crimes, and testify to the wrongness of what had been done. I could hold the memory of victims and acknowledge the guilt of perpetrators. But forgiving history is different. One learns to live with it. In later decades, I did what many of us did. I read. I read post-war studies about production, the logistics papers, the military historians who could lay out the threads of supply in columns of type. I pored over accounts of the Red Ball Express, the convoys that moved supplies from Allied beaches inland after Normandy, and the British-American pipeline experiments that threaded undersea and underland, moving fuel in ways that made denial affordable. These were not stories of heroism in the traditional sense. They were stories of engineering, planning, and relentless labor. Records of the time show how many convoys ran day and night, and how railheads and harbors were repurposed for the single purpose of feeding engines. That, more than a dozen small tactical victories, determined the endurance of armies. I returned to the Ardennes years after the war, at the behest of a historian friend. They were careful. Museums and commemorations had grown up over the decades, places where artifacts and narratives could be arranged and labeled. The villages had been rebuilt where they could. The forest had been allowed to breathe again. I stood at the edge of what had been a depot and felt the ground remember, as if soil keeps a record in a way we cannot read without coming and listening. An empty Tiger tank in a museum near Brussels might serve as a symbol for visitors, but I remember the hollow machine in the field better, its fuel gauge frozen in an economy it no longer served. That visit was not merely personal curiosity. It was an attempt to place the face of memory onto the body of history. Seeing archival photographs on display, reading captions that laid out dates and volumes and operational names, I felt less inclined to romanticize anything. The museum label next to a picture of burning drums said simply and plainly that the depot had been destroyed to deny resources. The footnotes suggested sources in the archive. It was sober, and it was necessary. History needs both the human voice and the ledger of production to make sense of an event like the Ardennes offensive. Over the years, I have sat in rooms with historians who can argue with a cold accuracy about numbers, barrels, convoys, truckloads per day. They speak of industrial capacity as a kind of geometry. If you have a given number of refineries and available shipping tonnage, here is the maximum flow of fuel you can sustain at the front. They are not writing elegies, they are writing accounting. That accounting does not make the loss less painful, but it shows why men on the ground were often fighting a war planned elsewhere. It also shows why the Germans, brilliant tacticians though many were, could not overcome the combinational advantage of the Allied logistics chain.
I should say something about responsibility again. We have to be careful when we translate strategic analysis into moral exoneration. The argument that we were simply outproduced can be used to excuse brutality if one is not vigilant. I have met men who use the arithmetic I now rehearsed as defense for things that cannot be defended. Saying that logistics mattered does not absolve those who committed crimes.
The Malmedy massacre I have referred to is not an example of supply lines at work. It is a moral crime, a stain that men and institutions must own. I condemned it then, I condemn it now. Some of the officers involved were judged after the war. The process was imperfect, and the wounds did not close quickly. Those events taught me that learning the lessons of logistics must be coupled to moral clarity. At home, I found a strange landscape of remembrance. Where there were once flags and lists, people began to talk quietly about reconciliation and reconstruction. There were memorials to the dead from all sides, and as the years turned into decades, visits from foreign families, American, British, French, became more common. We would stand in churches and parks and listen to names read aloud, and for a while the ritual of remembering became a way to teach that war was not a game, but a specific pattern of loss. Being declared dead and then returning gave me a weird authority in those rooms. People looked at me as if I had experienced death as a kind of apprenticeship. I did not like that. No one does. Work kept me occupied. I found employment in logistics again, ironically enough, working for a company that shipped goods across borders. There was a pragmatic satisfaction in moving crates and finding efficient routes, in balancing supply and demand in a peacetime economy. I often thought that if a society could keep its plumbers and drivers fed, it could avert some of the desperation that tips men into conflict. That thought sounds naive when said like a half-remembered slogan, but it became a modest ethic for me. Make pipes, not weapons. Keep the pumps running cleanly so men do not have to choose between hunger and violence. There were other consequences I did not expect. The sensation of waking up to a new moral and strategic language pushed me toward testimony. In community halls and schools, and once on a radio program, I tried to explain what I had learned. That bravery without supply is a brittle thing, that an offensive is an equation as much as a strategy, and that policy made in some distant office can decide the fate of a child on a field. People listened. Sometimes they thanked me. Sometimes they challenged me. All of that was useful. Memory is a conversation, not a speech. At 89, the weight of that conversation shifts toward accounting for legacy. I think of the young faces I saw in the winter of 1944, faces that in some cases did not get a chance to grow old. I think of the victims of massacres whose names deserve a better hearing than I can give in a short telling. I think of the men who returned and became fathers and who had to explain their scars without the language of justification. Memory requires humility. History requires rigor. Both demand that we do not let convenience reshape truth. I have met Americans, British, French veterans who have stood in my kitchen and asked questions that no strategic paper can answer. How did it feel? What were the smells? What did you think when you saw people set fire to what they had? I answer them plainly. I tell them that the smell of gasoline smelled like hope and like insult at once. I tell them that when the depot burned, something in me died because a narrative I had lived by, about honor and straightforward bravery, was supplanted by an economy of endless replacement. That is the core of my waking. Not that machines mattered more than men, but that machines and the people who fed them had the power to decide the horizon for men like me. There are practical lessons here for any time. Logistics are not glamorous. They are not flashy. They do not win parades, but they do determine endurance. If you wish to understand power, you must trace the supply lines, the factories, the docks, the men who drive convoys. In our era, those lines are diverse and global. That does not make them less decisive. Political choices shape them. Investments and priorities decide who runs the pumps. To ignore that is to expect courage alone to produce outcomes it cannot. I have tried to live a life in recognition of those facts. I have tried to teach my children and their children that what looks like the edge of history is often the end of someone's supply chain.
Be curious about the work that goes on unseen. Respect the people who move goods. Remember the victims of cruelty, and do not allow the elegance of strategy to obscure accountability. There is a personal closure I seek to give myself. Some years ago, a small documentary crew asked to film me at the museum where an empty tiger stands behind glass. They wanted a veteran's voice to introduce visual material. I consented. Standing in front of that tank, with visitors pointing and children peering at rivets, I felt the past become an object for the present. I could have given them a speech about industry and math. Instead, I told them, in a voice that shook a little, that when I found the jerry cans in the snow, I thought for a moment that the war could be bought with a handful of drums. I had to tell them that the true victory belonged to those who could supply an army day after day. I told them also that in that knowledge I found a different kind of duty, to bear witness. If there is an ethic to my old age, it is this: wake up early to the realities that shape events, and then make small, steady choices that honor truth. Do the uncomfortable accounting. Teach young people that courage is not enough. Equip them with an understanding of the infrastructure that undergirds any large action. Push for accountability. Remember victims, and do not let the ledger become a cover for wrongdoing. I will end where I began, because there is satisfying gravity in that circle. They put my name on a paper and called me dead.
In a deeper sense, the man I was, who believed a victory could be carved by audacity alone, was declared dead by the flames at Stavello. Waking up changed everything for me. It did not make me joyful, nor did it give me easy answers. It forced me to look at the world with a new set of tools: facts, arithmetic, and a stern sense of morality. At 89, I carry those tools and the memory of those winters. I am small now in the face of time, but the memory remains large and precise. I offer it to you not as a sensational tale, but as a careful report, a testament that the machinery of nations, pipes, trucks, refineries, and the labor that keeps them running, can decide destinies even when men fight bravely at the front. If you want to go deeper into this thread, into how the Red Ball convoys moved mountains of supplies, or how pipelines under the sea were engineered, I gathered sources and recommended readings in the description. There are historians who map these things with a clarity I cannot match, and their work is worth your time. If this account moved you, consider watching our piece on how the Red Ball Express kept an army alive, and subscribe to follow more close studies like this one. Remember the past carefully. It asks us to be wiser than we were.